Hello and welcome to Mosaic with us. Today, my guest is Robert W. Graffio. Call you Rob. And Rob works for the Archdiocese of San Francisco. Rob, you're a canon lawyer. You'll tell us what that means. You are also the vice-chancellor of the Archdiocese and manager of the Tribunal. So, first of all, let's talk about being a canon lawyer. Tell us what that means, what canon law is, and how one becomes an expert in it.
So canon law is the Catholic Church's body of internal law. It's different from American law. Oftentimes when I tell people I'm a canon lawyer, if they have no familiarity with the Catholic Church or the term canon law, they think that that's just one of the many branches of law for which someone goes to an American law school. And I have to sort of correct them a little bit and tell them, well, it's like a foreign body of law. It's like,
interesting.
You know, for a law from another country. And
I always thought people associated it instantly with the church law, but you say no.
Some people may have that connection, they may make that connection, but other people never heard canon law.
Okay.
You know, so there are people out there who just don't have that foundational understanding or have even heard the term. So, you know, it's the Church's internal body of law. You know, to be a canon lawyer is to have studied that in a canon law school and to get a degree in it. There's one place in the United States where you can do that. That's at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C.
One place in the United States?
Yeah.
And who certifies your knowledge, your expertise?
The professors do upon the comprehensive oral examination and successful completion of all the classes and the writing of a major thesis.
Yeah.
So there is no postgraduate test like a bar exam, like an American lawyer would do, but it's the faculty of the School of Canon Law that certify your competence to practice canon law.
And the overall arching authority for such a school is the Vatican in some ways?
It is the Vatican. The Vatican's the Holy See, we call it more, is they set the criteria for the curriculum.
Yeah.
And that curriculum was actually revised not too long ago, maybe a little more than 10 years ago, to make it more rigorous, because there used to be a shorter period of time required to get the first canon law degree, which is a JCL, and then you can go on to get a doctorate in canon law, which is a JCD. So they overhauled that curriculum and made it, they lengthened it out a little bit and made it a little more difficult and rigorous to get that degree.
Interesting. A special branch of learning. You probably don't have to do it all in Latin, right? You can do it in your vernacular.
The lectures are certainly all in the vernacular. I got all my lectures in English. But you do take Latin classes because the text of the law is in Latin.
Yes. And
all translations really are supposed to be a secondary way of reading the law. You're supposed to, this is the expectation, that you read it in the Latin. Don't quiz me on my Latin. And then it would only secondarily, you'd read it in the vernacular. So, yes, you have to study that Latin a little bit.
And I said in my intro that this body of knowledge could be contained in a single volume. I have the volume right here. This, I believe, though this is, in here is the Latin text and then an English text. So the Latin text, if it's half of this book, is not that copious. There's not that much to it.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I have to maybe just correct one thing. Most of the Church's law is contained in that volume, but there are other sources of law, including new law that was made after that 1983 Code of Canon Law was promulgated. Just in the last 6 years of this current pontificate, Pope Francis has made a lot of new law, and they haven't printed any new volumes or done any new revisions of this code. So through motu proprios and apostolic constitutions, just to give you one example of an apostolic constitution, Pope John Paul II set forth the law that governs a papal election, what happens when the papacy is vacant, how the Church is governed in that temporary period until a new pope is elected, what are the procedures that have to be followed for the election of a pope. And that is not incorporated in the Code of Canon Law. So that's part of the broader, what we might call ecclesiastical law or church law, but it's not in the code. But the code is supposed to be the most essential law in a single volume that you can find most things in.
And I want to say this, having browsed through this volume, it's an English translation with the Latin. I don't find it obscure or difficult particularly. It's a thing you could browse through and learn something, right?
That's true, yes. And the translators in English, the Canon Law Society of America, they put a very useful table of contents, and they also put a very useful index in it, and so not just the average layman, but even a canon lawyer finds great use in making reference to that table of contents in the index.
Now, when you become a canon lawyer, what is your typical career path? How do you use that skill?
Most end up working for the institutional church for a diocese.
Yeah.
I mean, traditionally, canon lawyers had always been priests, and still the majority of them are. Really, but after Vatican II, when things changed a little bit, there were more maybe religious sisters who went to study canon law and became canon lawyers and worked for their local dioceses. And then lay people who were not religious also increasingly, as they were more involved in the various aspects of the church's ministry, would go on to study canon law, and they would find jobs with their local diocese, and a lot of them in the tribunals.
And you mentioned the word tribunal. You're called manager of the tribunal, and the Archdiocese of San Francisco has a tribunal, and it's a kind of what is it? It's a little bit of a scary word.
Right. Men
in black, judges, decrees, sentences. What does a tribunal do?
So a tribunal is essentially a court. The word tribunal is a little more formal and traditional than just saying court. But believe it or not, as fancy as the word tribunal sounds, we don't have an actual formal courtroom in our office setting. We have a typical office setting, but we do carry out judicial processes in the tribunal, which is what a tribunal is for. There are some little paperwork, administrative processes that we do as well, but the core of a tribunal's work is judicial processes. The most common thing we do is marriage nullity trials.
Yeah.
So people who are looking for a declaration of nullity of their marriage would bring a case. We call that person the petitioner, and the person that they were married to is the respondent.
Okay.
And so we might conduct a trial with evidence and testimony and.
We'll talk about that in detail in another segment. We're going to take a brief break right now. We'll come back and talk more with Rob Graffio about church law and church governance. Welcome back to Mosaic and our discussion with canon lawyer Rob Graffio. Now, Rob, we understand a little bit about canon law, the law that governs the church and so on, and you're a lawyer in that field. There's an important piece of church discipline, church procedure that I hinted at in my introduction, which is the keeping of records. And it's interesting because there's such a contrast between the vast universal church, it seems to me, millions of adherents, and then the local church on the corner where your particular life is encased. If your ancestors have ever done any genealogical research, you hear about they went back to Europe and they went to the village and they found the priest and they got the records from whatever, the 16th century. So you've told me that record keeping is an important part of the church's function and of the canon lawyer's specialty.
Yeah, well, the church keeps very detailed and lengthy records on sacraments especially, and we're concerned about those records not primarily for genealogical reasons, but for the purpose of the living. They still are of value even beyond the person's life, but especially while they're living, we want to know what their status is in the church. So we keep records for baptism, for confirmation, okay, for marriage, holy orders, if a man is ordained a deacon or a priest, or even beyond that, a bishop, those things are recorded in the Sacrament of Registers. When somebody dies and has a funeral in parish, that is recorded as well. Yeah. Whether they were attended to by a priest before their death, that's recorded. So these are all important things to understand a person's status in the church. Yeah. And the most important ones are baptism and confirmation and holy orders, because those are the three sacraments that leave a permanent mark on the soul. Yeah, we've been taught, in Catholic school. Yeah. So there is no erasing that mark, not in this life, not even in eternity. So it's important that we have a record of that so that we know that, about somebody's status in the church, that they were initiated as a Catholic or perhaps ordained into the ordained ministry.
And again, these records are entered and kept in your parish, in your local parish. You know, if we can, I'd like to run one slide here to show you a recent news story. And if you can see this, there's a happy-looking Dominican pastor in San Francisco. And take a close look at the more or less tattered-looking volumes on the desk before him. The story here in the Chronicle from March is that a safe, a large safe the size of a refrigerator, was stolen from St. Dominic's Church late one night, trucked away, and broken open. The thieves apparently were after gift cards that the church gives out to the homeless and poor, but someone found these jettisoned volumes in a dumpster and phoned the church about them. So, Rob, tell us what we're looking at. What's that pile of books on the...
These are essentially what your sacramental registers look like. These are particularly old ones because I understand these volumes go back, some of those volumes anyway, go back to the foundation of that parish in the 19th century. This is, effectively what your sacramental registers are going to look like. Some are newer than others. And when a sacrament happens, like I said, a baptism or a confirmation or a marriage, a handwritten record of that is going to be put in those registers with pen on paper, the ink sinking into the page and presumably sticking around for over 100 years. That's the idea.
Well, yeah, when we think about storage, information technology, and so on, of course, there's all kinds of ways to do it. And the first response is, can't you go digital on that? And what's the answer to that?
Well, the short answer is we're told no. And that's what I tell parishes that ask me that question. I just got done doing a round of presentations in each of our 3 counties in this archdiocese on sacramental registers, and that question came up in each of those 3 presentations. What about the digital future of sacramental record keeping? And I say, well, the Holy See won't allow it, but there are reasons for that. And one of those, and I've heard this even from people who are not, from the Vatican telling me, that's just people who have a technology background, who have an understanding that versions of things change. Software's change, hardware's change. Everybody knows that we've gone from keeping computer information on magnetic tape to then a large floppy disk, a small floppy disk, a CD for a CD-ROM, a thumb drive, operating systems in PCs or Macintosh change. So you wonder how the information that's recorded at one time will be able to be accessible digitally 50 years down the road with all those changes in technology. So these are some of the cautions about it, plus the potential for it, in a catastrophic situation, being wiped out.
Yeah.
Whereas with hard books, you have to burn those things. You have to have a fire that would consume a parish office where they're kept, which would be in a safe, which would, to some extent, not totally fireproof them, but delay their consumption by fire, give the fire department a little more time, or be totally stolen. But
so it's interesting to consider. I mean, you go by a parish church, and they're having a Catholic mass, they're having something, but inside that parish church, there's a large, fireproof, major safe that is keeping the spiritual records of people for hundreds of years, right?
Right.
That's pretty amazing. That's a duty of the pastor to take care of that.
That's right. I mean, we expect the state and the county to safeguard our birth records and our civil marriage records. We wouldn't want them to treat them very casually. And so we want, for us Catholics who have our sacraments recorded, we want the parish and the pastor of those parishes to take the same kind of care with those sacramental records because they're so important in our status.
That's great. So look, we're going to take a little break now. We'll come back and talk further about the Tribunal and the Sacrament of Marriage. Hello and welcome back. We're talking with Rob Graffio, canon lawyer, about canon law and its many uses. There's an important part of canon law, as I understand it, which is the law governing the sacrament of matrimony, right?
Yes.
And you are the manager of the Tribunal of the Archdiocese. And I know the Tribunal is connected with adjudications of matrimony in certain ways, right? So can you explain what that's all about?
Right. So as I think I made mention of before, people will sometimes bring their marriage cases. These are people who are divorced, and they want to clarify their status in the church and whether they in fact had a valid marriage or not. They especially want to know if not, because they want to know whether they have the possibility of having a future marriage in the church with someone else. Okay, we don't do dissolutions of sacramental marriages. We don't do divorces either. What we do are trials that require evidence and testimony to really make a determination of whether a marriage was null from the moment of the wedding, when the consent of the bride and groom was exchanged.
Now, I think most laymen are familiar with the term annulment. We hear it a lot. There are civil annulments as well, right? In civil law, a marriage can be declared null and void. But in church law, it's something special. So you said you have a trial. What exactly is on trial in this trial? Is it an adversary proceeding in some way?
Well, believe it or not, we don't use the term adversary, but believe it or not, the code does have, they call it the contentious process. So there is, it does presume that the respondent, okay, could be opposed to what the petitioner is seeking, which is a declaration of nullity. That's not the case every time. Sometimes the respondent either agrees with what the petitioner is seeking, namely a declaration of nullity of their marriage, or could be totally indifferent and not participate in the process.
And the goal of seeking a definition, a judgment of nullity is to be able to marry again, or simply to declare that this marriage was not a valid Catholic marriage?
It's definitely the latter in every case. People want to know that, whether just for their own peace of mind, to confirm what they feel like they always knew, or it became clearer to them as time went on. But it's also the former as well. People do have the practical thing in mind of wanting to marry in the church in the future. But in order to do that, that does not follow on the church approving of a divorce, but declaring that the marriage never existed from the beginning. And that's a difficult thing to wrap your mind around for people to swallow, because especially if you've lived some number of years together, if there are children that were born of this marriage, you know, to then say that the marriage didn't exist, at least in canon law, according to the criteria of what the church expects to make a law, to make a marriage valid from the beginning.
It existed as a civil marriage,
correct,
it didn't or to use that term, but not as a sacramental Catholic marriage.
That's a good distinction. We're not at all, tribunals are not at all sitting in judgment of whether something was civilly valid or not. It's separate from that. It's according to our own internal law, our own canon law, and whether the marriage was valid in that law.
So you must deal with people at a very difficult time of their life, whether they're adversaries or agreed. A marriage has been broken somehow, and you people are dealing with investigating its genesis and deciding on its sacramental quality. It's difficult work.
Right, yeah.
And you're dealing with people. I would say this, canon law governs this tribunal work, right? Doesn't canon law also govern preparation for marriage? It
does. Canon law mandates that before anyone gets married in the church, they have to go through a process of marriage preparation. And we have a marriage and family life office in the Archdiocese of San Francisco, which assists the parishes and the pastors and the people in the parishes that do marriage preparation with couples, and helps to support them. And so, yes, so I coordinate with our marriage and family life director, and he asks questions about canon law, and I'm not involved directly in marriage preparation, but I am aware of it and understand that it has canonical foundations.
It seems to me it's a very careful, this whole body of law, preparation and judgments of nullity, it's a kind of delicate investigation into people's most inner lives, it seems to me. It must be, is it difficult work?
It is. My role beyond being the tribunal manager that oversees kind of day-to-day operations, I'm the defender of the bond in the process. So that's the official that I am in the trial. So the defender of the bond's role is to look for arguments that might point to the validity of the marriage bond. And the judges are the ones who are supposed to be the most objective and come to a decision at the end. And the petitioner might have an advocate that's making arguments for him or her about why they believe the marriage to be invalid. But no matter which angle you're coming at it from, whether it be defender of the bond or judge, you know, or even an advocate, yeah, it's difficult because you are dealing with those very sensitive areas of people's lives.
What I like about it is that the couple who have divorced or broken up aren't left alone without resources. The church is saying we have a forum in which you can explore your marriage and your sacrament. It seems to me that's what it's offering. So let's, we have a couple of minutes left. I want you to tell us whether a Catholic should be studying up on canon law in a certain way. Let me run a slide here that you recommended. This is a website. Rob was telling me that he Of course, the Vatican has the complete canon law on its website, and it's consulted there. But he said this particular little jaunty-looking website, canonlaw.ninja, he said it's very interesting and searchable. You can search for whatever question is puzzling you. So a resource for both professional and armchair canonists, canonlaw.ninja. So Rob, with a minute left, can you tell us what you think Catholics should take away from this and what their attitude toward canon law should be?
Well, canon law is not something to be seen only as through a negative lens, telling you no, that thou shalt nots. You know, it's something that gives order to the church and its ministries and all the various charisms. And I pulled out from John Paul II's introduction to the 1983 Code of Canon Law a little interesting quote in which he said,
Make it quickly.
This is a close paraphrase.
Seconds.
Yeah, so it's not meant to be a substitute for faith, grace, and charisms and charity in the life of the church, but rather to create an order for those things, for their growth in the ecclesial society as well as in the individual. So people should not be afraid of it. They can certainly search it out on this website. They could get their own volume and look up some things that interest you in the index and do a word search.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you for being here, and thank you for joining us on this episode of Mosaic.